All right.
Let's see
Here, if
looks
looks like we are live. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. This again is Hamza the historian. I'm here to read more of the origins of Muhammadan jurisprudence by Yusuf Schacht. And we are on chapter 2. The ancient schools of law, Shafi'i's attitude towards them. Someone I got to spend time with in Chicago there, he was teaching at the University of Chicago. His name is Dr. Omar Farouk Abdullah, and he does not have the highest opinions of Schacht, to say the least. His book, Malik in Medina with Brill, you can read that and see why. But he basically calls this book, or Schacht rather, a shaitan, because not only does he have a lot of factual mistakes that have since been disproven, but if you look at my series on Orientalism, you can see why the epistemological framework, or to use Foucauldian terms, the grill, is problematic, and we'll get into that as we read. To begin, Shafi'i is known as the founder of one of the 4 surviving orthodox schools of law. It was not his intention to found such a school, and Muzani, the author of the earliest handbook of the Shafi'ite school, declares at the beginning of his work, I made this book an extract from the doctrine of Shafi'i and from the implications of his opinions, for the benefit of those who may desire it, although Shafi'i forbade anyone to follow him or anyone else. That must mean taqlid. Shafi'i devotes a considerable part of his writings to discussions with and polemics against his opponents, but always with a view to making them acknowledge and follow the sunnah of the Prophet. And he speaks repeatedly against the unquestioning acceptance of the opinion of men. Must mean here, ra'i. So Muzani, in case you didn't know, is one of the premier students of Shafi'i, but also the uncle of Imam al-Tahawi. The older schools of law to which Shafi'i is opposed know a certain degree of personal allegiance to a master and his doctrine. Amongst the Iraqians, we find Abu Yusuf referred to Abu Hanifa as the prominent lawyer, and Shaybani to the companions of Abu Hanifa. Shafi'i refers to those who follow the doctrine of Abu Hanifa, or to his companions, and calls him their master. But also Abu Yusuf has followers of his own. The most outspoken passage is one in which an Iraqian opponent, presumably Shaybani, acknowledges Shafi'i's doctrine as good. But Shafi'i retorts that, as far as he knew, neither the opponent had adopted it nor another of his ilk who lorded it over them, presumably Abu Hanifa. Some of the Medinese rely on Malik for their knowledge of traditions, and consider Malik's Muwatta as their authoritative book, which they prefer to all others and which they are accustomed to follow. They are the followers of Malik, and he is their master. They regard his opinion as if it were the consensus, and there is no consensus for them besides Malik in Medina. But they are only a fraction of the Medinese, just as the followers of Abu Hanifa are only part of the Iraqians. The real distinguishing feature between the ancient schools of law is neither the personal allegiance to a master, nor, as we shall see later, any essential difference of doctrine, but simply their geographical distribution. Shafi'i is explicit about it, Every capital of the Muslims is a seat of learning, whose people follow the opinion of one of their countrymen in most of his teachings. Shafi'i goes on to mention the local authorities of the people of Mecca, Basra, Kufa, Syria. Elsewhere, he refers to the Iraqians, the Madanese, the Basrans, the Kufans. The scholars of each place where knowledge of traditions is to be found, the people of different countries, and he gives detailed lists of these local authorities. One of these lists shows the variety of doctrines within the great geographical divisions. In Mecca, there were some who hardly differed from Allah, and others who preferred a different opinion to his. Then came Zenji bin Khalid and gave legal opinions, and some preferred his doctrine, whereas others inclined towards the doctrine of Sa'id bin Salim, and the adherents of both exaggerated. So Zenji usually refers to East Africa, land of Zenj can refer to Somalia, for instance, and we know that Somalia was a suzerainty of the Umayyad Caliphate. In Medina, people preferred Sa'id bin Musayyib. Then they abandoned some of his opinions. Then in our own time, Malik came forward and many preferred him, whereas others attacked his opinions extravagantly. I saw Ibn Abi Zinad exaggerate his opposition to him, and Mughira ibn Hazm and Darawardi follow some of his opinions, whereas others attack them for it. In Kufa, I saw people inclined towards Ibn Abi Layla and attacked the doctrines of Abu Yusuf, whereas others followed Abu Yusuf, disagreed with Ibn Abi Layla and with his divergences from Abu Yusuf, and others again inclined towards the doctrine of Sufyan Thawri and that of Hassan bin Salih. I have also heard of other instances of this kind, similar to those which I have observed and described. Some Meccans even think of Atta as more highly than of the successors, and some of their opponents place Ibrahim Nakhai of Kufa at the top. Perhaps all these adherents of different masters exaggerate. And that's a quote from Shafi'i. Shafi'i insists on the fact that the reputation of all these authorities varies much, and that they hardly agree on a single point of law or a general principle. If Shafi'i denies here the existence of reasoned agreement even between the several prominent scholars in each center, he does not, on the other hand, imply the existence of any clear-cut fundamental differences in legal theory between the local schools. It was exactly their common reliance on living tradition and their free exercise of personal opinion. In other words, their lack of strict rules such as were elaborated only by Shafi'i, that led to wide divergences in doctrine. So here, we notice that Schacht is still heavily relying on Shafi'i. He just keeps quoting Shafi'i and Shafi'i's texts, and he's not really looking at other sources that talk about these other jurists. So he's really getting a one-sided, biased kind of view of things and just running with it, instead of getting other historical sources, narrators, to corroborate what is going on. So, for instance, he could be looking at Tabari, Ikhtilaf al-Fuqaha type texts. He could be looking at Tafsir al-Tabari and these different places where you can find opinions of, these early jurists preserved. You could be looking at, the texts that preserve the opinions of al-Azami, or he could be looking at some more texts from Abu Yusuf and Muhammad Shaybani, but instead he's just citing Shafi'i, and that's one of the big critiques of Schacht's work. So to continue, there was as yet no trace of the particular reputation of Medina as the true home of the Sunnah. A reputation incompatible with Shafi'i's terse statement, "We follow this tradition from the Prophet, and so do all scholars in all countries except Medina, and so do the great authorities," and with his sustained polemics against the Medinese. The three great geographical divisions that appear in the ancient texts are Iraq, Hejaz, and Syria. Within Iraq, there is a further division into Kufans and Basrans. Although occasional references to the Basrans are not lacking, little is known about their doctrine in detail. And our knowledge of the ancient Iraqians is mainly confined to the Kufans. This is not really entirely the case any longer. In Hejaz, there are two centers, Medina and Mecca. And again, our information on Medina is incomparably more detailed. The Syrian school is mentioned rarely, but we have some authentic documentation on its main representative, al-Azami. So Schacht here, this is kind of one of the things that he's famous for, is he makes kind of these like geographical divisions, which he gets from Shafi'i. So in the footnotes here, he's just citing Shafi'i, and he's taking these kind of descriptions or divisions from Shafi'i. Of course, Shafi'i reports much more about Mecca and Medina because he studied in those places, lived in those places, etc. So yeah, he's not really consulting a wide plethora of texts from the period as one would think. So to continue, Egypt did not develop a school of law of its own, but fell under the influence of other schools. There were followers of the Iraqian doctrine in Egypt, but most of the scholars there belonged to the Medinese school, of which they formed a branch. Shafi'i refers to them in the writings of his later Egyptian period as Egyptians or as some of the people of our country. So he kind of is ignoring Imam Layth here. In Egypt, while it is true that the Laythi doctrine was later replaced by predominantly the Maliki school, but also secondarily the Shafi'i school. So to continue, Shafi'i considers himself a member of the Medinese school and references the Medinese Hejazis as our companions, and to Malik as our master, or our and your master, occur over the whole range of his writings, from his early to his late period. Also, his Iraqian opponents regard him as one of the Medinese, or a follower of Malik, or one of the Hejazis in general. But Shafi'i does not identify himself with the particular adherents of Malik within the school of Medina, although he is eager to defend Malik against an undeserved attack. In other contexts, Shafi'i keeps his distance from the Medinese in general and denies responsibility for those of their opinions which he does not share. So I mentioned in the last video kind of briefly Stephen Judd at the University of Southern Connecticut, I believe it is. And he kind of rejects the way that Schacht characterizes, Shafi'i and Schacht characterize these geographical schools, and that's kind of one of the things that Schacht has been heavily criticized for. Is he constantly talks about the Syrians and al-Azami. And Stephen Judd, he wants to look at the fact that Sufyan al-Thawri and Imam al-Awza'i agree on many opinions, and overwhelmingly had the same students. And he argues that they, both of them together, kind of formed what you may call as one Umayyad madhab. So he's kind of refuting Schacht in that regard. And, this whole theory of regional schools that developed into the madhab is for the most part dispelled in current scholarship. No compromise was possible between Shafi'i and the Madinese, nor indeed any other ancient school of law. On their essential point of difference in legal theory concerning the overriding authority of traditions from the Prophet, as opposed to the living tradition of the school. When he comes to this subject, Shafi'i attacks the Madinese with the strongest possible words. The whole of treatise number 3 is a sustained attack on the Madinese for their failure to follow the traditions from the Prophet, which they relate themselves, and failing that, their own traditions from companions and successors, and an effort to convert them to his own point of view. In this connection, Shafi'i even uses arguments which do less than justice to the Madinese. Shafi'i attacks the Iraqians just as vigorously as he does the Madinese. Even where he has to agree with the Iraqians and to disagree with the Madinese, he is inclined to dissociate himself from the former and identify himself with the latter. Often he shows himself one-sided by sparing or excusing the Madinese and directing his full attack against the Iraqians. He shows the same sympathy for al-Azami as against the Iraqians. He attacks the Iraqians repeatedly with unjustified arguments and distorts their doctrine. A strong personal prejudice against Shaybani appears in several places, most clearly in treatise number 8, page 3, where Shafi'i calls Malik a greater than he. So we also must remember that Shafi'i himself was a student of Muhammad Shaybani for some time. And he has a lot of, I guess you could say, ferocity against Muhammad Shaybani, according to Schacht here. And so I think Schacht is kind of alluding to the fact that perhaps a great deal of Shafi'i's writings are against the Hanafis, especially Muhammad Shaybani. And we also have to remember the historical context here, the socio-political context, where Hanafis were essentially the state-sponsored madhab. Abu Hanifa was critical of the Umayyads and Umayyad scholars. Abu Yusuf, is refuting Imam al-Azami, who was very closely associated with the Umayyads, as Stephen C. Judd points out. They're obviously refuting the Madinese, Hajja ala Ahl al-Medina. So, there's a lot going on here, and perhaps Schacht is trying to present himself maybe a little bit along the lines of the Ahl al-Hadith as well, and being kind of a counter-culture movement that's against, trying to subvert in some ways the dominant status quo of the Abbasid Caliphate. So here Schacht, he has all these treatises that he keeps citing, and I don't really know if there's a, you must have in the book somewhere some kind of legend or code or some way to understand which treatises he's talking about. So I'll try to figure that out here so that we can better understand exactly what he's citing. Because when he says treatise number 8, which text from Shafi'i is he actually citing there? It's kind of a little confusing. It's a bit archaic, academic citation standards, if you will, that aren't really used today. This is before really people were using computers. This was probably written with almost certainly with a typewriter. And so, yeah, the technology was just different. So he says here only in ich, it's IKH, must be some type of treatise here, only in ich, a treatise of late composition, we find several very polite references to the Iraqis. Shafi'i hopes that the argument which he is going to give will enable his Kufan interlocutor to convince all his companions who, after all, know the several doctrines and logical reasoning, page 38. Shafi'i acknowledges that his interlocutor has shown himself objective throughout, and now knowing where the truth lies, he has to draw the consequences, page 53. Shafi'i refers to a prominent scholar belonging to those who disagree with us most persistently, that is the Iraqis, page 328. Apart from his sentimental attachment to the Madani's, and notwithstanding his vigorous polemics, Shafi'i shows himself on the whole remarkably free from school bias. He starts as a follower of the school of Medina, having developed his legal theory and put the whole of the law on a new basis. He turned against his erstwhile companions and tried to convert them to his doctrine. Finally, he has also tried to convince the Iraqis, whom in his earlier period he had treated with scorn. Soon after the time of Shafi'i, the geographical character of the ancient schools of law disappeared more and more, and the personal allegiance to a master became preponderant. So here this is Shafi'i, or Schacht's theory that Islamic law kind of started with local schools of thought, that are associated with various localities like Kufa, Basra, the Hijaz, or what have you. And they eventually kind of transformed or morphed into legal schools that are their authority lies within their founding eponymous master, such as Shafi'i, or Abu Hanifa, or Imam al-Azami, or Layth, or Ahmed ibn Hanbal, Abu Dawud al-Zahiri, وهكذا, and so on. Like the Jariri madhab that was associated with, Tabari. And so, to go to chapter 3, Shafi'i and legal traditions. The main theme of Shafi'i's discussion with his opponents is the function of the traditions from the Prophet. Shafi'i insists time after time that nothing can override the authority of the Prophet, even if it be attested only by an isolated tradition, and that every well-authenticated tradition going back to the Prophet has precedence over the opinions of his companions, their successors, and later authorities. This is a truism for the classical theory of Muhammadan law. But Shafi'i's continual insistence on this point shows that it could not yet have been so in his time. Shafi'i, it is true, claims that his opponents agree with his essential thesis. Question: is there a sunnah of the Prophet established by a tradition with an uninterrupted chain of transmitters, isnad, to which the scholars in general refuse assent? Answer: no. Sometimes we find that they disagree among themselves, some accepting it and others not, but we never find a well-authenticated sunnah which they are unanimous in contradicting. That's from Shafi'i's Risala. But Shafi'i's introduction of the element of unanimity into the discussion, and even more so the actual doctrines of the ancient schools of law, which provide him with the subject matter for his sustained polemics, show that his claim of a general agreement is only a clever debating point made by him. with their own legal theory much less developed and forced by Shafi'i to confront a problem of which they had not been consciously aware. The ancient schools of law had no answer, and Shafi'i made the most of his opportunity. This explains the influence that his doctrine was to have on the legal theory of all schools. Shafi'i prides himself on having always held this attitude towards traditions from the Prophet, and he declares, I have unwaveringly held, thanks be to Allah, that if something is reliably related from the Prophet, I do not venture to neglect it, whether we have a great or small opposition of companions and successors against us. We find, nevertheless, traces of an attitude corresponding to that of the ancient schools in some of his early treatises. And in other instances, it can be inferred from later information, but these are exceptions. And on the whole, Shafi'i's doctrine on this point is consistent as he claims it to be. His development from a natural acceptance of the Medinese doctrine, in which he grew up, to the systematic acceptance of the traditions from the Prophet, is reflected in Risala 38, where he tells how he learned of a certain formula in his youth from his masters. Later heard the isnad which belonged to it and which carried it back to the Caliph Omar, and finally heard his companions, that is the traditionists, relate different forms on the authority of the Prophet. So the traditionists must be the Ahl al-Hadith. The main text in which Shafi'i puts forward in his theory of traditions is treatise number 3, directed against the Medinese. He begins by stating his case. Every tradition related by reliable persons as going back to the Prophet is authoritative and can be rejected only if another authoritative tradition from the Prophet contradicts it. If it is a case of repeal of a former ordinance by a latter, the later is accepted. If nothing is known about a repeal, the more reliable of the two traditions is to be followed. Repeal here, he must mean like nasikh, mansukh, that type of thing. If both are equally reliable, the one more in keeping with the Quran, and the remaining undisputed parts of the Sunnah of the Prophet is to be chosen. Traditional form, or traditions from the Prophet, whether they conform or contradict it, if the other persons had been aware of the tradition from the Prophet, they would have followed it. End quote. Treatise number 3, introduction of that treatise. Shafi'i repeats and elaborates this statement, the second half of which is particularly important with tedious monotony. I'm going to take a quick drink here. It is significant that Shafi'i insists on these repeated statements of a principle, which was to become a commonplace later. When discussing problems on which he and the Medinese follow the same traditions from the Prophet, the battle is joined in earnest. When Shafi'i comes to those numerous cases where the Medinese set aside traditions from the Prophet in favor of traditions from other persons. He confesses that he has tried hard to find an excuse which would justify this procedure in his own eyes or in the eyes of any other scholar, but has been unable to find it. This, he says, applies only to traditions transmitted by reliable persons, but these must be accepted unquestioningly, and no tradition from the Prophet can be set aside for anything but another tradition from him. Men need the guidance of the Prophet because Allah has obliged them to follow him. What Shafi'i has said ought to convince his interlocutor, Rabi', that he must never reject a tradition from the Prophet, except for another tradition from him if both disagree. The Medinese, then, and the ancient schools of law in general had already used traditions from the Prophet as the basis of many decisions, but had often neglected them in favor of the reported practice or opinions of his companions, not to mention their own established practice. Shafi'i realized that this gave no consistent and convincing basis for legal decisions, and the only certain authority he could find was that of the Prophet. So he made the traditions from the Prophet to the exclusion of everything else the basis of his doctrine. This simple solution enabled him to find a way through the maze of conflicting traditions from the Prophet, the companions, and other authorities. But by restricting himself to traditions from the Prophet, which were in his time a purely accidental group, Shafi'i cut himself off from the natural and continuous development of doctrine in the ancient schools of law. According to Shafi'i, the traditions from the Prophet have to be accepted without questioning and reasoning. If a tradition is authenticated as coming from the Prophet, we have to resign ourselves to it, and your talk and the talk of others about why and how is a mistake. The question of how can only be applied to human opinions, which are derivative and devoid of authority. If obligatory orders by asking why could be subjected to analogy or to the scrutiny of reason, there would be no end to arguing, and analogy itself would break down. And here he's quoting that text, I'm not sure what that stands for quite yet. And so basically what Schacht is saying here is that he finds Shafi'i to be more or less criticizing the Hanafi tradition, because the Hanafis, they did not only look at the isnad, or the chain of narration, in hadiths, but they also used reasoning to look at the metan, the contents of the narration. So if the hadith says something strange that contradicts the Quran or contradicts other stronger hadith, then the Hanafis are more likely to throw it out, especially if the Quranic statements or the stronger hadiths are general, and this hadith that is weaker is talking about something specific, khas. They'll almost always throw it out in that circumstance. And so Shafi'i is kind of criticizing there what he would describe as willy-nilly use of reason. When confronted with two or more traditions from the Prophet which contradict one another, Shafi'i uses harmonizing interpretation. His Kitab Ikhtilaf al-Hadith, maybe that's what the here is standing for. His Kitab Ikhtilaf al-Hadith is particularly devoted to this subject. If one knows two seemingly contradictory traditions and finds that they can be harmonized by distinguishing between their respective circumstances, one must do so, page 271. Shafi'i never considers two traditions from the Prophet contradictory. If there is a way of accepting them both, he does not invalidate a single one, because all are equally binding. He considers them contradictory only when one cannot possibly be applied without rejecting the other, page 330. He gives a detailed statement on his method of interpreting traditions in Risala, says 30, folio 30. So that means clearly dealing with a manuscript there. But anyways, so here what we can see is that Shafi'i more or less is criticizing Hanafis because Hanafis are very apt to throw out contradicting hadiths. If a hadith contradicts with a higher epistemological source in Hanafi epistemology. You can look at my history of the Hanafi madhab videos to get into this a little deeper. But if you have a hadith that contradicts a higher authority in their epistemology, being the Quran or a stronger hadith, they're just apt to more kind of throw things out rather than try to specify meanings or resolve contradictions in kind of some what I would call Hanafis would describe as mental gymnastics. That's what they would feel like Shafi'is trying to do some weird, strange mental gymnastics to make a contradictory, weak hadith kind of fit into a system. And so in that way, they might say that Shafi'i is using willy-nilly reasoning. And Shafi'i is looking at them saying, you're just getting rid of all these hadiths that very well could be from the Prophet, and you're ignoring the prophetic tradition, the Sunnah. So it's a debate between these two schools of thought, and I think Shafi'i much more than anything is criticizing his former teacher Muhammad bin Hassan al-Shaybani. So to continue, when conflicting traditions cannot be harmonized, Shafi'i's declared intention, as we have seen, is to choose the one more in keeping with the Quran and the remaining undisputed parts of the Sunnah of the Prophet. He elaborates this rule in several passages, such as Risala, folio 40, where he says, if two traditions are contradictory, the choice between them must be made for a valid reason. For instance, one chooses the one which is more consistent with the Quran. If there is no relevant text in the Quran, one chooses the more reliable tradition, the one related by men who occur in a better known isnad, who have a greater reputation for knowledge or better memory, or else one chooses the one related by two or more authorities in preference to a single authority, or the one which is more consistent with the general tendency of the Quran, or with other sunnahs of the Prophet, or more in keeping with the doctrine of scholars, or easier with respect to analogy, and finally the one followed by the majority of the companions. But Shafi'i often has to fall back on the artificial expedient of counting the traditions and letting the greater number prevail, an expedient which was already used before him by Hanafis. The affirmative statement prevails over the negative one because it implies a better memory, and the fuller statement, which contains additional matter, is to be preferred to the shorter one. But Shafi'i himself acts against this last rule in what I presume is the Ikhtilaf. It says Ikh there, so that was Kitab Ikhtilaf al-Hadith, folio 364, and even gives theoretical reasons for doing so. All these considerations do not afford him a sure guidance, and he is reduced to affirming, in the manner customary in the ancient schools of law, that those traditions and variants which he does not accept are unreliable. The assumption of repeal is not resorted to unless it can be established by a tradition from the Prophet or by a chronological indication showing that one tradition comes after the other, or by a statement coming from those who have heard the tradition of the Prophet, or from the generality of the scholars, or by another method through which the repealing text and the repealed one becomes clear. Kitab Ikhtilaf al-Hadith 57. So that is different from the Hanafis. The Hanafis, like I said, they're much more apt to kind of throw hadiths out when they contradict with stronger evidences. Shafi'i says, no, let's find some way to reconcile this. Let's maybe specify the meaning of these general statements. So he's, heavily criticizing the Hanafis here. But Shafi'i is not always able to apply his own method. In Kitab Ikhtilaf al-Hadith, folio 88, In face of the settled opinion on a major point of ritual, he assumes repeal and neglects an otherwise well-authenticated tradition, basing himself on traditions from persons other than the Prophet, and making assumptions of a kind which he rejects indignantly when they come from his opponents. As regards the repeal of traditions, or technically the Sunnah of the Prophet by the Quran and vice versa, Shafi'i holds that the Quran can be repealed only by the Quran and not by the Sunnah, which is supplementary to it. The Sunnah, on the other hand, can be repealed only by another Sunnah. Whenever Allah changes his decision on a matter on which there is a Sunnah, the Prophet invariably introduces another Sunnah, repealing the former. Otherwise, it would be possible to reject any tradition from the Prophet which did not agree with the Quran, and every Sunnah could be abandoned if it stood beside a Quranic passage which was couched in general terms, even though the Sunnah could be made to agree with it. This theory seems to balance Quran and Sunnah evenly, but it makes the Sunnah as expressed in traditions from the Prophet prevail over the Quran, because, as we shall see, the Quran is to be interpreted in the light of traditions. Shafi'i's theory of repeal breaks down over the problem of punishments for adultery and fornication. He says that's both in the Kitab al-Risala and Kitab Ikhtilaf al-Hadith. So the Quran does not contradict the traditions, but the traditions from the Prophet explain the Quran. That is treatise number 9, page 5. The Sunnah of the Prophet is never contradictory to the Quran, but explanatory. No tradition from the Prophet can possibly be regarded as contradicting the obvious meaning of the Quran. So here again, this is Shafi'i's basic, main point here, that hadiths are supposed to specify a general Quranic statement, so that a hadith can give more information as to what a hadith is supposed to mean there. It clarifies the Quranic statement. So it looks like someone wrote here in the comments, have you any thoughts on the passing of Moses McCormick? I know he was the reason you got into Islam. Wow. I did not know Moses McCormick passed. I will have to look into that. That's some heavy news right there. So to get back to Schacht here, no Sunnah ever contradicts the Quran, it specifies its meaning. Risala 33. The best interpretation of the Quran is that to which the Sunnah of the Prophet points, and the best way of interpreting traditions is not to make them contradictory, because we must accept the information of trustworthy persons as much as possible. Ikhtilaf al-Hadith 296. Shafi'i repeats and elaborates these statements in other passages. He speaks contemptuously of those who dare to criticize traditions because they seem to contradict the Quran. If it were permissible to abandon a sunnah for the opinions of those who are ignorant of the place which is assigned to it in the Quran itself, one might as well regard a number of fundamental doctrines, all of which are based on enactments of the Prophet, as repealed by the Quran. Whoever holds this spirits away the majority of the sunnahs of the Prophet, and that is ignorance. Risala, folio 33. The Shafi'i basis his unquestioning acceptance of traditions from the Prophet on the Quranic passages which make it a duty to obey the Prophet. He interprets the term hikmah, wisdom, which is used in the Quran together with book as a name for the divine revelation, as referring to the sunnah of the Prophet expressed in traditions. On the question whether the sunnah of the Prophet is to be regarded like the Quran is divinely inspired wahi, Shafi'i shows himself non-committal. But in any case, the enactments of the Prophet are accepted as coming from Allah in the same way as the explicit orders of the Quran, because Allah has made obedience to the Prophet obligatory. Treatise number 7, page 271. And everything legally relevant that the Prophet has allowed or forbidden has in fact been allowed or forbidden by Allah, because Allah has ordered the Prophet to allow or forbid it. Treatise number 9, page 5. So I'm going to stop there. It looks like I'm having some technical difficulties even here with my webcam. So for those who are following along with PDF, we are on page 16 of The Origins of Muhammadan Jurisprudence by Schacht. And we will be continuing with the bottom paragraph of that page next time. Thank you for listening. Be sure to check out my Patreon page, my Facebook page. You can find me on Twitter. Please give the video a like and hit the subscribe button if you're not a subscriber. Thanks again for listening. Ma'assalama.